Before we taxi into this true story, if you believe leadership can turn chaos into second chances, subscribe to The Story Beyond the Impact, tap like, and share this episode with someone who needs steady hands in a storm. I wasn't supposed to remember the smell of coffee on July 19th, 1989. But that's the last ordinary thing I recall, burnt sweet, airline strong, before a day the news would later file under United Flight 232. We were a traveling cross-section of America, grandparents bound for birthdays, kids sticky with soda, business travelers defending briefcases like shields. I had seat 24A, left side, just ahead of the wing route, where the window shows you both the world and the mechanism that carries you over it. The airplane, McDonnell Douglas DC-10, felt like a train station turned into a machine wide as a street, built for routines I trusted. From Denver to Chicago, routine was the product. Pushback, taxi, rotation, that clean upward insistence where your chest remembers how to believe. The cabin settled into the domestic soundscape of flight, the cart's percussion, the soft arithmetic of belts and buckles, ice knocking like polite knuckles in plastic cups. A boy behind me asked his mother if clouds were soft. "Not for airplanes," she said, and I smiled at a stranger's lesson. Somewhere in the middle of the sky, routine cracked. It did not announce itself with drama. It tore. A bang from nowhere and everywhere. The kind of sound that makes a cabin forget its grammar. My cup jumped. My heart followed. The airplane shuddered with a coarse vibration that didn't fit any memory. Out the window there was no flame, no theatrical plume, just a shiver in the wing's confidence. Then a noise that wasn't a noise at all, the sudden absence of the background hum that has always told me I am safe, not quiet, wrong. You learn to watch the crew the way sailors watch the sea. A flight attendant near row 20 lifted her head like a deer, hearing what we couldn't, pressed a finger to her interphone, and slipped a calm she was still borrowing onto her face. The seatbelt sign lit. Its chime carried the weight of a sentence we hadn't been taught in school. We were turning. My stomach said left. The window said the horizon had picked a side and was clinging to it. Clouds lay down in the wrong direction. Then the voice, the one the world would later recognize as Captain Al Haynes, came over Channel 2, steady in that way only someone strangling panic can be. The words were simple. We'd had an engine failure. We were working the problem. We were diverting. It was not the content that saved me. It was the cadence. He thanked us for our cooperation. He said the crew would do everything in their power. That sentence, that promise, I felt it pass down the aisle like a handrail we could hold. You can't guarantee outcomes at altitude, but you can promise effort and discipline. In that moment, I decided those were the only currencies I cared about. We would learn later in diagrams and documentaries how the Numiga 2 engine's fan disc had failed, how shrapnel cut arteries no one knew to protect, how we were now a 3-engine jet with no hydraulics, no elevators, no ailerons, no rudder, a creature without sinews trying to steer by flexing bone. But inside row 24, the reality was narrower and more human. The floor trembled with a coarse, low-frequency buzz. The airplane wanted to roll right and descend when it felt like it. And every movement we made needed a reason. Leadership travels fastest through timbre. The captain's next call was for the flight attendants to prepare the cabin. I watched professionalism turn into choreography, carts stowed with a single decisive shove, galley latches checked like commandments, voices pitched low and factual. Shoes on, belts tight, remove sharp objects from pockets. A woman across the aisle began to cry, not loudly, but in the way someone cries when her body has reached the edge of its map. The attendant knelt, palm to the armrest, and spoke the sentence that would become a refrain. We are going to work the plan. Work the plan. The promise had children, and that was one of them. We banked again, that unnatural sawing motion you can feel in fillings and faith. I pressed my hand flat to the wall, the way you do with a feverish child. The fuselage thrummed back. I'm still here. It wasn't reassurance exactly. It was data, and I clung to data because fear is an instrument that lies without meaning to. After minutes that felt like measurables, the PA clicked. The captain named our diversion field, Sioux City, Iowa, a name that should have meant nothing and suddenly carried the gravity of a place that might accept us alive. There was talk later of a fourth pilot joining them in the cockpit, a DC-10 instructor who happened to be aboard, Dennis Fitch, bringing with him a kind of know-how you don't learn until you break airplanes on purpose in school. At row 24, this knowledge arrived only as an improvement in the rhythm. Our turns became less sharp, our descents less like falling. It felt like four minds had agreed not to surrender. If leadership is a promise, teamwork is its proof. The brace briefing came, not in cartoons and pantomimes, but in sentences that refused to blink. When I say brace, heads down, feet back, arms across. In my row, we practiced with the clumsy intimacy of strangers who know they might depend on one another's bodies in the next hour. I folded my glasses into a sock and tucked them into my shoe because someone said to, and because doing is a kind of thinking. The woman beside me, accountant's hands, wedding band worn thin, whispered, "Do we pray?" I said, "We prepare." It felt like the same word. We dropped again. Not an elevator fall, more a staircase with missing steps. Outside the window, the world was layered. Strips of field, rectangles of water, the geometry of a country that believed in order. Inside, we were inventing a new aeroplane out of an old one, urging it to obey by trimming thrust on one wing and adding on the other. I didn't know the term then, differential throttles. I knew the sensation of being carried by judgment instead of by muscle. Cabin crew, be seated. The words land different when you've been watching them move like purpose. They buckled in, and we were alone, temporarily with our own instructions. I thought of my father teaching me how to change a tire. Don't rush. Put your weight where it matters. Know where your hands are. I placed my hands on the seat in front, felt the imperfect give of upholstery, and waited for the call that would make everything small and necessary. When it came, it was not theatrical. It was workmanlike, the way you speak when you keep a promise. Brace, brace, brace. Time did a strange mercy then. It didn't slow. It widened. In the extra room, I could fit three things: the captain's promise, the crew's plan, and my job, which was to follow. The rest, the noise of the ground deciding to meet us, the wings' argument with air, the history of a fan disc cutting through a century of engineering, could live outside my head for another minute. We were not saved yet, but we were led. And there are moments in a life when that is the difference that keeps the difference possible. Impact isn't a boom so much as a chorus. Tires, soil, metal, gravity, time. We met the runway not as a line, but as an orchard of forces, each fruit insisting we remember its taste. The first touch was crooked, our right side hungry for earth, the left catching up in a lunging pirouette no airplane has any business attempting. Then the cartwheel, not the full movie kind, the Iowan kind, stuttering and low, ripping the field into punctuation. Noise became texture, scrape, tear, hiss. The cabin, which had been a church of instructions, turned into a factory producing the present tense: get low, hold, wait. In the factory of now, small orders carry big oxygen. Heads down. Stay down. Not yet. The flight attendants were our metronomes, broken loose in their seats, some injured, all leading anyway, the air filled with burned things that used to be materials and promises. I counted to 10, because I'd been told to count before I looked up. At 8, something inside me tried to become a bird. At 9, the voice of row 20 said, "Not yet." At 10, a click like a door admitting it is a door, and then, "Up, out, now." When leadership works, it travels down the bones of strangers. My legs obeyed before my brain got consent papers signed. The aisle was an alley of light and smoke, a geometry you navigate by touch more than sight. A man with a bleeding scalp moved forward because that was the only cardinal direction any of us had left. A woman pushed a toddler into my arms, the child a hot weight of future I didn't deserve to hold. "Take him," she said, and her voice held a captain's promise too. Leadership is contagious when it's clean. The slides worked like gravity's polite cousins. We fell down them into a world where the colors were wrong, too clean a green for a day like this, a blue sky that refused to be a metaphor. Sioux City was already busy with us. Fire trucks drawing bright lines across a field, paramedics moving with that enormous composure emergency gives to the trained. Somebody counted us, which felt like being collected from a storm. Somebody prayed over a person who didn't answer. It sounded like inventory taken aloud. There are truths you only learn with your cheek against grass. One is that a promise made on a PA system can survive impact enough to finish its work on the ground. We'd heard the captains vow to do everything in their power. On the slide, in the field, in the stumbling lines toward buses and triage tents, that vow had become dozens of people doing their square inch. A firefighter cutting belt webbing with an economy that respected time. A nurse saying, "You're in shock," like it was weather that would pass. A cop offering his radio to someone who needed to tell a mother he was not a voice in a list. Later I learned names: First Officer William Records, Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak, Instructor Pilot Dennis Fitch, men whose hands did math while the airplane insisted on poetry. I learned words: impossible, unprecedented, loss of all hydraulics, that looked good in black ink and terrible in fuel smoke. I learned that many lived and many didn't, a sentence that sits down in you and doesn't get up. But in the hour where the sun didn't have the heart to move, what I lived inside were small decisions that made giant outcomes possible. An attendant checking shoes because a heel can kill a slide. A stranger passing a water bottle up the line without needing thanks. A paramedic touching a wrist before talking to your face, because blood is a language you can trust. In a gym that smelled like sweat and school, we were reorganized into people again. Wrists tagged, wounds triaged, families found or not yet. A volunteer in a church t-shirt pressed a foam cup of orange juice into my hand, and it tasted like childhood, which is to say like mercy. I asked about the crew because that is what you ask when you've been carried. No one had an answer that wasn't careful. "Working," someone said. "Alive," someone else said, and left the sentence there to breathe. The captain's promise followed me around the room like a well-trained dog. It took different forms: the medic taping gauze with tender competence, the cop who turned his jacket into a pillow for a woman on the floor, the flight attendant who, with a burn on her hand, still coached strangers through breathing, in 2-3, out 2-3, and in doing so gave us instructions for a life that wasn't over. Leadership had multiplied, divided, and gathered itself again in human-sized acts that didn't ask to be called heroic. Sometime after, a figure appeared at the doorway and the room's temperature changed. He wore the posture of someone who had just worked a storm and was grateful to be wherever this was. Captain Haynes, not mythic, not cinematic, just a man whose voice we had trusted before the earth took it away, stood there with eyes that carried every seat number. He spoke without owning the air. He said thank you to us first, which felt backward and exactly right. He said we had done our jobs. He said the crew had tried to keep a promise and that the promise was still working in the hands of the people in that room. There is a moment survivors don't talk about because it doesn't photograph, the collective exhale when someone worthy tells you the thing you did mattered. The room loosened by one notch. People who had been holding themselves together with teeth let their shoulders rest against painted cinder block. The boy whose mother had said clouds weren't soft was asleep in her lap, the gentlest argument for systems I've ever seen. Night folded over Iowa with the steady professionalism of a curtain call. In the dark, the day began to re-edit itself. The captain's promise was no longer just a sound wave. It had become architecture, the way the attendants kept a corridor clear, the way a retired fire chief showed up in jeans and ran a staging area like a symphony, the way the hospital's triage tags turned panic into sequence. And then the legacy began. Though we didn't have that word yet, people remembering how leadership sounded and choosing to speak like that when their moment came, on highways, in boardrooms, in kitchens where bad news needed a calm voice. I didn't sleep. You don't. The first night your body learns fragility without theory. I watched a volunteer fold blankets with a care that made time obedient. I counted the breaths of the kid in the next cot like he was my nephew. I held an ice pack to my own shoulder as if nursing it were a job I could put on a resume. Somewhere before dawn, a nurse pressed a card into my hand with a number to call for support and a note that said, "In blue ink, you did well." No one tells you how much that sentence can restore. It gave my hands back to me. By morning, the story had left our bodies and entered the world of words, cameras, podiums, statements. The numbers would come, and with them, the guilt that survivors bargain with like accountants of fate. But in the ledger I keep, the first entry is still that promise and what it birthed. Small orders obeyed, small orders issued, small orders carrying big oxygen into a burning situation until the human thing could be done. Leadership made seconds, seconds made runway, runway made survivors. And a vow that never claimed certainty taught me what to ask of people when the world breaks. Don't be a hero. Keep a promise. Work the plan. If this story hit you in the gut, tell me in the comments. Leadership saved lives or seconds a runway. I'll be reading. The gym became a country. Baskets on the walls, tape on the floor, a scoreboard that had never counted anything this serious. Every corner held a briefing, and each briefing felt like a handhold on a cliff. A firefighter in yellow taught 5 of us how not to pull a neck the wrong way if someone fainted. A nurse, with a voice like a metronome, explained why some people tremble when they aren't cold. A volunteer in a church t-shirt drew a map of the field on a whiteboard and marked it with little X's where strangers had laid down their lives and where others had stood up again. Leadership didn't look like speeches, it looked like lists. I watched a flight attendant with gauze wrapped across her palm turn a gaggle of townspeople into an evacuation team with 4 sentences and a roll of duct tape. You, doors, you, blankets, you, water, you, count. No one argued. We had all graduated to the same rank, useful. That promise the captain had made, everything in our power, kept showing up wearing different uniforms. At the far end of the gym, an air traffic controller stood in his work shirt like a man surprised to find himself off the tower floor. He had eyes that still watched sky, even while indoors. He spoke softly about the minutes up there, the runway they reopened, the equipment they pre-positioned, the way he made his voice into a runway for pilots whose hands were outnumbered by the airplane's needs. He didn't call it heroism, he called it a checklist. On a cot near mine, a woman in a cardigan with burn marks along one sleeve rehearsed the brace command for the volunteers who'd asked what it sounded like from the aisle. She didn't change her tone to perform it. She kept it workmanlike, which made my eyes sting. "It has to be the voice you can obey over the noise," she said. And every person within earshot nodded like students who know the test is tomorrow morning. I learned that day that orders are oxygen when they are small, specific, and kind. A paramedic set a hand on my shoulder and said, "Drink the whole cup." It was the only sentence I could fully complete without thinking, and that made it perfect. Another said, "Call one person." I called my father and said a sentence that felt like building a bridge plank by plank. "I am alive, I am hurt a little, I am safe." He wept in a language older than words, and I let him because leadership is also letting someone else feel so you can keep functioning. By late afternoon, rumor had made a camp by the door. People said the captain had walked in. Others said he had broken every bone and still shook hands. Others said every member of the crew had a story of a small decision they wouldn't let be called a miracle. The truth, when it arrived, was quieter and better. The captain sat, not to dramatize his fatigue, but to normalize ours. He thanked the town. He thanked the crew. He thanked the passengers for doing their jobs. And then he did something I didn't expect. He named the chain of little choices out loud. We turned the APU on early. We moved fuel to balance a roll that wouldn't listen. We decided what to say and what not to say on the PA. We let Dennis fly the throttles because he knew a trick the rest of us needed. He did not use the word trick. He used technique. He did not use the word miracle. He used teamwork. He did not say I. He said we, and the room breathed easier because we is a stretcher that can carry a lot of weight. Someone, a row behind me, asked if he'd been afraid. He didn't polish the answer. Yes, he said. The word landed like a tool on a bench. That's why we used the tools. He meant checklists, call-outs, a tone you can hang your mind on. He meant CRM and practice, not romance. He meant that a promise is a thing you work, not a magic that you summon. In the evening, a priest and a therapist stood shoulder to shoulder, answering questions that belonged to both their trades. Why did we live? Why did they not? What do I do with the sound? The answers were not tidy. They were small, and they were next steps. Sleep in the light on the first night. Eat even if it tastes like cardboard. When the roar comes back, say the word now out loud and count to 10. I wrote that one on the back of my wrist in ballpoint as if the body could learn by osmosis. At some point, time had lost its habit of behaving. I found myself beside the instructor pilot whose hands had choreographed the throttles. He looked like a teacher at the end of a very long school day, chalk on his soul. I said thank you in a voice that shook. He answered with a sentence I have put in my pocket ever since. We kept adjusting. He didn't say, we saved you. He didn't say, we were geniuses. He said, we kept adjusting. That's what leadership sounds like when it refuses to make itself large. I imagined the cockpit then as a room where time had been made to obey. 4 men, no hydraulics, a flight engineer doing arithmetic on a day when arithmetic was a lifeboat, a line pilot calling speeds and altitudes, an instructor pilot shaping thrust into a kind of rudder, a captain who understood that managing the team was the only way to manage the machine. It didn't make the rows of cots feel less full. It made them feel less random. Night wore on. The gym grew warm with human persistence. A woman walked the perimeter, handing out earplugs, because even mercy is loud in a space like that. A teenager swept the floor around the stretchers as if tidiness might coax back dignity. A local diner sent pies, which is the only correct response to disaster in the Midwest. Every slice tasted like a sentence ending with a period, strong and merciful. Before I slept sitting up, the flight attendant from row 20 came by. The gauze on her palm had stained brown. You did well, she said, repeating the nurse's line without knowing it. You followed orders. I laughed, a thin version of it, and said, give me more. She did. Tomorrow, shower, move your arms, drink water, don't read the comments. When the why starts chewing you, feed it a what, one thing at a time. I have wanted to argue with heroes about the word hero ever since. They don't want it. They want you to do your inch. The promise the captain made had multiplied until it filled a city block. Hospital, gym, field, runway, tower, diner. Everybody doing their inch in the direction of life. When I finally closed my eyes, the roar was still there, but it had company now. The sound of clipboards, of zip ties, of Velcro, of gloves snapping, of measured voices, of wheels on linoleum, of a town turning itself into a bridge between sky and ground. The promise had made seconds. The seconds had made orders. The orders had made oxygen, and oxygen had made a night that more of us got to see all the way through. By the 3rd day, the TV anchors had learned to pronounce Sioux, and the nation had learned the distance between impossible and done anyway. I learned that hospitals are built to hold 2 kinds of time, the time of treatments and the time of telling. The doctors owned the first. The captain and crew shared the second with us in a room that looked like a church basement and felt like a cockpit placed gently on carpet. He started where you start if you mean it, at the point where choice first appeared after the bang. We lost hydraulics, he said, and added, we didn't lose agency. He placed the words where we could reach them. He described how they tried everything they had been taught, and then they tried each other. "We let skill find the right seat," he said, meaning Dennis Fitch on the throttles, meaning Bill Records reading the air with his bones, meaning Dudley Dvorak doing the math of balance while the airplane leaned toward its own physics. It wasn't a legend. It was a workflow. He spoke about tone, the way a voice can carry weight without adding panic. "You can't make the airplane lighter with your voice," he said, "but you can make the human in it lighter." He said they chose words because words become actions in a cabin. Brace, heads down, shoes on, wait, now. In the back row, someone cried softly. It wasn't grief, it was recognition. We had been led without being lied to. And then he did what leaders do when they understand the difference between guilt and responsibility. He spread the ownership. He spoke the ground into the story. ATC made a runway out of a city. Fire and rescue made a city out of a field. Hospital staff made a field into a ward. Volunteers made a ward into a family. He gave us all a job in retrospect, which is a gift, because helplessness is the bruise that lasts longest. When someone asked about the moment he knew the landing would go badly, he refused to let the story be a lottery. "There wasn't a moment," he said. "There were hundreds. We kept moving each one inch toward manageable." He didn't let fate keep the copyright. He gave it to craft. After he spoke, the engineer among us, the one who in peacetime designs machines to do boring things reliably, stood and drew a box on the whiteboard. "Promise," she wrote inside it. "Around it rolls, around those skills, around those decisions, around those seconds, around those people." It looked like nested Russian dolls, but it behaved like a checklist. The captain smiled, the private smile of a man who knows a diagram, when he sees one, and said, "That's pretty much what we flew." The journalists wanted sound bites. The crew kept giving them sentences. CRM taught us to talk like teammates, not titles. Training taught us what to try next when nothing normal worked. We used to think of failures as single points. We don't anymore. If you listened, the legacy was already walking into other rooms, cockpits, classrooms, emergency departments, board meetings where someone would one day say, "We don't know what will happen, but we can decide what we'll do if it does." In my own body, the debrief felt like a tuning. The roar in my ears had been wide and indiscriminate. Now it had frequencies. Hydraulics, gone. Flight controls, gone. Thrust, available, shapeable, the new language. Words, available, shapeable, the older language that turns panic into tasks. The captain's promise had never been about invincibility, it had been about focus. After the meeting, I found a bench outside where Iowa was being its exact self. Cottonwoods thinking about breeze, a pickup truck deciding between gears. A nurse I hadn't met sat beside me with the elegance of a person who knows how to appear without alarming. "You'll get weird for a while," she said, and I almost laughed with relief at the tacit permission. "Here's what to do. When you hear the roar, ground yourself. 5 things you can see, 4 you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. And make a promise to yourself you can keep by Friday. I promised to sleep with the light on and to say now when the memory tried to make me say then." In the days that followed, I watched the promise replicate. The town started a blood drive, not because they knew us, but because they'd been asked to value small orders that become big oxygen. A high school opened its showers to survivors because showers are not trivial when you've met the earth hard. A group of farmers offered their fields as quiet places for relatives to stand where we had slid. They understood that sometimes the only way to face a fact is with both boots on. I don't remember leaving Iowa. I remember arriving back into a life that had become provisional. Doors at home sounded different. Elevators felt like broken clouds. The kettle's sigh made me brace until it didn't. Friends asked for the movie version, and I gave them the work version. Lists, tones, orders, seconds saved by people who tried the next right thing. A neighbor left soup on the step, and a note that said, "We keep our promises here too." I taped it above my desk and let it be a companion to the checklists I'd started to write for ordinary days. Weeks later, a letter came from the airline with resources for trauma and a line that said, "Our crews are reviewing procedures. We are listening to the lessons." I read it twice, not because corporate language warms the blood, but because listening is part of the vow. Listening is how a promise breeds legacy. In time, we would hear about training rewritten, simulators updated to teach the art of buying time with throttle and patience, briefings altered so passengers know the work they can do when the chime sounds. I've been asked since, what did that promise really do? It didn't change physics, it changed us. It made the cabin into collaborators rather than cargo. It made the town into partners rather than audience. It made the crew into a single mind with many hands. And the legacy it left in me is a sentence I can use when nothing makes sense, but people are looking to me anyway. I can't guarantee the outcome, but I can guarantee the effort. When I say it, I hear a voice on Channel 2, and the rustle of a gym turning into a country, and the soft Iowa night learning to make room for grief and relief together. The promise didn't end when the microphones were packed. It learned to live in procedures and habits, in the way I now ask better questions at work, in the way my kids now practice brace like a game, in the way I talk to strangers when we've all just heard a noise we don't understand. That's leadership's best secret. Its afterlife is contagious. Weeks later, in rooms that smelled like carpet cleaner and government air, the story we carried in our bodies was translated into minutes and choices. The NTSB people didn't come in with capes or cameras. They came in with legal pads and a patience that felt like therapy for machinery. They asked me to tell it plain, what I heard, what I saw, what I did. They asked when the word brace reached my row, how many beats until the first touch, how long between up, out, now, and my shoes finding Iowa. They were counting not to reduce us, but to give our seconds a job. On a table lay the instruments of an afterlife. FDR traces like heart monitors, CVR transcripts that read like a script for courage written by engineers. I learned gently how the number 2 engine's fan disc came apart and threw shrapnel like a bad idea, and how those shards sliced through hydraulic lines that had never met a failure this mean in the same minute. I didn't need gory diagrams. I needed sentences I could stand on. The investigator with the softest voice gave me one. You lost control surfaces, not control. They didn't talk about miracles. They talked about technique. The cockpit had discovered a way to fly the airplane with thrust, a choreography of asymmetric power that turned engine levers into a kind of rudder and elevator. They named the people whose hands and heads had pulled time out of a day, trying to spend it all at once. Captain Al Haynes, First Officer Bill Records, Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak, Instructor Pilot Dennis Fitch. 4 job titles became one intention. What mattered to me most was what they asked next. What helped? Not in theory, in the cabin. I told them about tone, how the promise on the PA that the crew would do everything in their power traveled better than reassurance ever could. I told them about small orders that created oxygen inside panic. Shoes on, belts tight, heads down. Wait, I told them the attendant's cadence mattered as much as content, that the word now is a tool when it comes from a voice you already trust. The board listened like apprentices. One investigator wrote orders, oxygen, on the margin of his pad and circled it the way you circle a line in a manual you'll quote later. Another asked whether we had practiced brace more than once. We had. He nodded, as if confirmation of a small rehearsal justified 3 paragraphs in a future recommendation. In a witness room with taped windows and a kindness of stale coffee, I learned about the promise as policy. Up front, they keep a laminated card of memory items, actions you do without reading when reading would steal seconds. It struck me that the captain's sentence had become a memory item for leadership. Promise effort. Buy time. Make seconds spendable. The investigators, who spoke a language I could almost follow now, turned that into prose that would outlive sound bites. CRM isn't kumbaya. It's a work system that makes sure the best idea finds the right hands fast. The hearing months later felt like church with microphones. Instead of psalms, we read human factors. Instead of incense, we burned assumptions. The panel asked unelegant, necessary questions. Did training anywhere simulate a total hydraulic loss? No. Did anyone practice differential throttles as primary control? Not really. Was tone addressed in crew resource manuals the way checklists were? Not enough. It was an inventory of humility. Every no pointed toward a do. The news wanted numbers. The board wanted lessons. They published both. The press called us miracle survivors on Tuesday and moved on by Thursday. The people who build safety for a living kept typing. And because leadership begets leadership, something beautiful happened where I could see it. The airline sent letters that didn't just say we're sorry. They said we're changing. Simulators updated, profiles added, briefings revised. The words weren't loud. They were specific. Back in ordinary life, I started keeping a ledger of the promise. Not names, moments. A tower controller who squeezed one more vehicle off a runway so we could have it. A line of firefighters who traded eye contact like a baton. A stranger who cut my seatbelt with hands that only shook after. A nurse who put a warm blanket over shock and called it by name. A captain who refused to say I, even in a room that wanted a hero. I wrote a line at the top of the page and underlined it until the paper thinned. Leadership is the transfer of calm. The promise was the carrier. The crew were the amplifiers. The town was the speaker that made it big enough for us all to hear. There was guilt, of course, survivor math that won't balance. The investigators never tried to therapize it away. They gave me homework instead. What did your inch look like? I wrote. I obeyed. I held the toddler. I kept the aisle clear. I counted to 10. It felt small until one of them said, "That's how systems work. Small, aligned, repeated." At an internal debrief, the airline let a few of us sit in the back. We watched trainers treat the throttle as rudder technique, not as a myth to be admired, but as a skill to be taught. The lesson ended with the thing no crowd applauds: repetition, reset, try again, reset, try again with a different wind, reset, try with a different startle. It was the prettiest boredom I've ever witnessed. I wrote a new line on the card I keep behind my ID. Promise effort, not outcomes. Transfer calm, buy time, turn seconds into runway. The NTSB report arrived later like a book you already knew by heart. I didn't frame it. I put it in a drawer and kept the card on the fridge. Reports are important. Habits save more people. We were never the point. The point was, what happens next time someone hears a bang and a voice says, "We're going to work the plan." That's the legacy I wanted to live in. Not a statue, not a speech, but an updated sim, a tighter brief, a tone taught to new crews by old hands. A country that counts its seconds and then tells them where to go. Months after the hearings, a letter invited me to speak for 12 minutes to a class of EMTs at a community college gym that smelled like tape and ambition. 12 minutes is not a eulogy. It's a procedure. I brought no slides. I brought the card. I started with the coffee I remembered and the bang I can't forget, then did what the captain had taught by example. I promised them something I could keep. "I can't make your work lighter," I said, "but I can give you a sentence that carried me when air became geography." I read my card. I told them the voice mattered. I told them orders are oxygen when they are small, specific, and kind. I told them that when they say now, they lend the body a place to stand. The instructor, a veteran who keeps his hair short because time is a resource, stepped in. "Translate that into us," he said. So we did. Gloves on, scene safe, airway, breathing, circulation. Talk like you can spare a second for the person, even when you can't. The class wrote like they were taking a vitals reading from my voice. Leadership had jumped categories. Airplane lessons had put on boots. Word got out. A firehouse asked. A school district asked, "What do you say to kids when the world makes noise?" I said, "We can't guarantee the test. We can guarantee the practice." A hospital asked, "How do you tell a waiting room the truth without setting it on fire?" I said, "Transfer calm. Make seconds. Give people orders they can own." None of this was mine. It belonged to a cockpit that refused to be a legend when it could be a manual. I went back to Sioux City once, not to perform grief, but to study logistics. The field had summer written on it. The memorial said names the wind didn't interrupt. I stood by the fence with a firefighter who back then had been 23 and now carried a chief's radio with the modesty of a borrowed tool. He told me the small things that grew large. A hose coupling that didn't cross thread, a map somebody found a better way to fold, a watch sergeant who moved the staging area 20 yards and gave a path back to a bus full of strangers who needed soft chairs. He used the word we like a punctuation mark. There was a simulator in a hangar 2 states away that let line pilots practice the unthinkable. They invited me to sit in the jump seat, not to voyeur but to learn the new calm. The instructor dialed in trouble. The crew didn't panic, they transformed. Cadence first, then division of labor, then thrust as language. The airplane did not become easy, it became answerable. After the second run, the captain looked over his shoulder and said, "We don't honor them by glorifying it, we honor them by normalizing the adjustments." At home, the promise kept sneaking into ordinary. In meetings, when projects yawed, I heard myself say, "We can't guarantee Q3, but we can guarantee effort and sequence." At a crash of a different kind, a family argument, I lowered my voice the way a captain lowers a descent rate and watched the room obey physics rather than mood. Transfer calm, buy time. It turns out the best CRM works in kitchens. I started a strange little tradition on each flight I took after, a quiet pre-brief in my seat. Locate exits, shoes on, belt low and tight. If something loud happens, look for behavior before a story. I told a flight attendant once I didn't want to be the passenger she worried over. She smiled the kind of smile that belongs to people who keep us alive and said, "You're on our team." It was the word I didn't know I'd been waiting to hear. The internet tried occasionally to turn our day into content again. Anniversaries invite hot takes. I kept my rule, tell the boring truth whenever you can. If a producer asked for tears, I asked for checklists. If someone wanted a villain, I offered systems. Sometimes they stopped calling. Sometimes they aired the sentence anyway. The few times I saw a young pilot repeat the phrase, "seconds a runway" on a panel, I slept like I donated a lung and it had taken. A sergeant from Iowa State Patrol wrote to say he had started using "we will do everything in our power" at the top of bad scenes. "It changes my guys' shoulders," he said. "It changes the crowd's breathing." A middle school principal sent a photo of a poster above the intercom. Promise effort, transfer calm, buy time. Under it, fire drill voice only. I put that picture on my fridge next to the card. The card looked less lonely. A year turned into 5. The numbers, how many spared, how many taken, never left the arithmetic of grief. But my ledger of the promise thickened with uses. A friend called from the roadside after a wreck, voice high and thin. "I'm going to say a sentence to you," I said. "Repeat it back." We did that for 3 minutes. By the time the ambulance arrived, he had orders. Oxygen had snuck in. The last time I saw Captain Haynes, he did it again. Took a question that wanted drama and gave it craft. "What's the one thing?" someone asked. He said, "There isn't one. There's the next." It was an answer that denied the economy of broadcast and gave the economy of survival. It was, once more, a promise you could keep. On a quiet night, I rewrote my card one more time, the way you rewrite a checklist after a good sim session. Promise effort, not outcomes. Transfer calm, buy time. Turn seconds into runway. Orders are oxygen, small, specific, kind. Count to 5, look for behavior, normalize adjustments. Tell the boring truth whenever you can. I slid it back behind my ID. When the chime sounds, on an airplane, in a meeting, in a midnight phone call, that little laminate in my pocket means I don't have to invent courage. I can work it. The first time I flew with my kids, I smuggled a checklist into my pocket like contraband courage. The gate was ordinary, people negotiating snacks and overhead space, yet my chest remembered a gym in Iowa and a voice that promised effort instead of certainty. I decided my job wasn't to hide the past, it was to translate it. Before pushback, I gave them our family brief. 4 lines said like a game: shoes on, belt low and tight, count 5, look for behavior. They repeated it, giggling at the solemnity, and the giggle did what hope does. It made room. During climb, a pocket of chop knocked on the fuselage. 2 rows up, someone huffed the way people do when control forgets them. My youngest watched my face the way passengers watch flight attendants. I did what Captain Haynes taught me without ever meeting me. I transferred calm. Feel the wing, I said. It's working. We counted 5. The wing flexed like a professional. Behavior said, fine. At cruise, the captain spoke with that good, modest cadence. Weather ahead, cabin crew released. I showed the kids the exit lights, the brace card, the galley where people do small, exact work, so big metal stays friendly. If we hear a word we don't know, I said, we wait for the orders. Orders are oxygen. They nodded as if I'd handed them a secret handshake. I realized halfway over Nebraska that I had become the adult in the aisle I used to look for. No cape, just a tone that didn't set the room on fire. A woman across the way closed her eyes like she was negotiating with weather. I passed her a water and a sentence I keep ready. Count 5, look for behavior. She smiled into her cup because it's easier to accept help when it arrives small. Landing was uneventful, the prettiest word in aviation. On rollout, my son said, "We didn't even need the checklist." I corrected him gently. "We used it to be ready." That, I've learned, is the legacy. Not that disaster returns, but that discipline does, on time, every time, until ordinary feels safe again. At home, the card migrated from my wallet to the refrigerator. It runs our kitchen emergencies too: spilled milk, broken glass, teenage tempers, promise effort, transfer calm, buy time. The voice in my head sounds like Channel 2, but the hands are mine now. Tightening lids, lowering volumes, choosing busy over brave because busy repeats and brave depends on weather. Once, in rougher air than usual, the seatbelt sign chimed and stayed. I felt the old body memory try to sprint. I briefed it like a crew. Not then, now. 5. Behavior. The airplane shouldered the sky. The attendants did their walk like a metronome for nerves. The captain returned, not to soothe but to inform. Light to moderate for 10 minutes. We're with center. Flight controls normal. I love the word normal more than any lyric ever written. When the wheels kissed the runway, I touched the window. A habit, not a superstition. And thanked the system that keeps seconds in stock for days that ask for them. I thanked a promise that didn't end on a field. It found a way into a family. Leadership, it turns out, can be inherited if you keep the checklist where little hands can reach. I didn't plan to test the promise on asphalt. A summer storm had just rinsed the interstate. The world smelled like hot brake pads and petrichor. 2 cars did the choreography that makes strangers family for 5 minutes. One drift, one overcorrect, the long punctuation of a guardrail. I pulled over without debating it. Orders are oxygen, the card in my pocket insisted. I walked in like a flight attendant into a cabin gone loud. Voice low, step sure, eyes counting exits. A young man sat stunned, hands at 10 and 2 on a wheel no longer attached to a plan. I squatted to his level. "You're safe. Count with me. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Look at me. What hurts?" He named a shoulder. Good. Naming buys seconds. A woman on the verge of tears hovered. I gave her a job. Stand by that cone. Wave cars left. Big motions. You're in charge of space. Her shoulders dropped into useful. Another driver pressed in with the wrong energy, the kind that thinks louder is helpful. Back up, I said, calm with edges. Scene safe first. He blinked, obeyed, fetched the triangle I'd asked for. I heard sirens far off, our ATC inbound, and used the seconds to turn panic into sequence. Shoes on, belt stays, phone away, keep talking. Small, specific, kind. The paramedics arrived like a practiced answer. I transferred the picture. Single vehicle contact, male 20-ish, AOX 3 now, left shoulder pain, no head strike reported, belted, airbags deployed. We've got traffic control. It wasn't poetry. It was a brief. One medic grinned mid-glove. Thanks for the seconds. I stepped back the way a good captain lets the best idea occupy the right seat. The scene changed timbre the way Sioux City changed a field. Roles assigned, cadence established, now used like a tool. A trooper asked who started traffic. The woman lifted her hand with a shy pride I recognized from 1,000 small victories. I wanted to tell her she had flown the cabin for a minute. I just said, "You did well." Driving away, I felt the old tremor in my hands, not fear this time. Afterburn. I pulled into a rest stop and did the sensory drill the Iowa nurse taught me. 5 things I could see. A cracked map, a vending machine, a wasp, a boy in a cape, my breath on glass. 4 I could touch, steering wheel, keys, denim, the card. 3 I could hear, diesel idle, wiper click, my heart slowing. 2 I could smell, rain, rubber. 1 I could taste, mints, pocket SOP. The world returned to scale. Later that week, the trooper emailed, "You gave me my favorite report of the month." Months after that, the woman sent a note. "I didn't cry. I had a job. I made cars move. Thank you for the sentence. We never met again. We didn't need to." That's the legacy. Strangers inheriting a promise with no paperwork, only tone. I used to think leadership was a person at the front of a room. Now I think it's a sound we pass along until it lands where it's needed. We will do everything in our power. In a cockpit that launches a workflow. At a guardrail, it arranges people into help. In a kitchen at midnight, it makes a parent lower their voice and buy their kid 10 more seconds to find words. Back home, I rewrote the card one last time in thicker ink so it won't fade when hands sweat. Promise effort, not outcomes. Transfer calm. Buy time. Turn seconds into runway. Orders are oxygen. Small, specific, kind. Count to 5, look for behavior. Normalize adjustments. Tell the boring truth whenever you can. Give someone else a job. It lives behind my ID and beside the coffee filters. The day will come when neither airplane nor interstate is involved. Just a room where something breaks. When it does, I won't hunt for courage. I'll reach for cadence. Legacy doesn't arrive with trumpets. It shows up as a tone you hear again somewhere unexpected. Years later, in a training room at an airline campus that smelled of dry erase and coffee, I watched a new crew run a hydraulics out profile in the sim. Nobody posed for hero shots. The captain set the cadence. The first officer read the room. The engineer guarded the numbers. The jump-seater translated panic into procedure. When the motion stopped, the instructor didn't say miracle. He said good adjustments again. Repetition as reverence. I carried that sound home. We put a promise card on our fridge the way some families post chore charts. Promise effort, not outcomes. Transfer calm. Buy time. Turn seconds into runway. Orders are oxygen. Small, specific, kind. Count to 5. Look for behavior. Normalize adjustments. Tell the boring truth whenever you can. Give someone else a job. It didn't make us saints. It made us organized when the day tried to break. A kitchen fire became lid, knob, call, not shout. A midnight fever became water, cool cloth, count breaths, not Google. We learned to work the plan at ground level. There were public moments too. A museum docent guided me past a DC-10 cross-section and lowered her voice the way people do in libraries. "We use your flight," she said, "to teach tone." On a placard, Captain Al Haynes was quoted about teamwork and communication, Dennis Fitch about technique, Records and Dvorak about division of labor. Their sentences looked like checklists, because that's what they are. When the news came that our captain had passed, I didn't post anything clever. I sat at the table and wrote the only eulogy I trust. Thank you for promising effort and keeping it audible. Then I kept it the only way a passenger can, by passing the cadence along, at guardrails, in classrooms, in rooms with too much echo. Sometimes the roar still visits. In those minutes, I walk the 5-4-3-2-1 drill the Iowa nurse gave me, and the world snaps back into measurement. Other nights, I dream the gym, pie and bandages and strangers learning each other's names. I wake ready to give someone else a job when the day starts making noise. People ask what changed most. Not my fear, my vocabulary. I don't ask if it will be all right. I ask what is the next right order. I don't ask if I'm brave. I ask, am I busy? I don't ask for guarantees. I listen for promises. And when I hear one kept on a radio in a classroom from a tired parent counting to 5, I recognize my crew again, alive in other mouths. The long leg of after is mostly ordinary. That's the victory. A tone survived impact. It lives in manuals and in kitchens, on runways and in school hallways, in any room where a voice can choose to make seconds instead of noise. If you want to know our legacy, don't look for statues. Listen for sentences that hold. The last time I flew into Sioux City, I booked it on purpose. A short hop, a rented car, a quiet hour by the fence. The wind was doing its piecework on the grass. A CRJ rolled out, spoilers up like tidy opinions. I read the names on the memorial aloud, each one a full stop the world must respect. Then I did what survivors eventually do. I left, not to forget, but to continue. On the flight home, I did my family brief under my breath. Shoes on, belt low and tight. Count 5, look for behavior. The captain's voice slid down the aisle with that familiar, modest authority. Weather, routing, time to destination. When Chop found us, the tone didn't change. Neither did mine. The promise had become muscle memory. Legacy isn't magic. It's maintenance. The NTSB measured minutes. The trainers turned them into profiles. The crews turned them into cadence. Towns turned them into logistics. And the rest of us turned them into habits. The day a fan disc tore our hydraulics out also handed us a sentence we could carry. We will do everything in our power. If you say it right, people can work inside it. Before descent, I took the card from my wallet and traced the edges with my thumb. It's creased now, sweat softened, ink blunted by years of pockets and guardrails. I added one more line in tiny print, the only flourish I allow. Arrive, then help someone else arrive. We touched down like a decision made correctly. Straight, brief, sure. At the door, I thanked the purser for the cadence. She smiled the way professionals do when praise is just a cue to keep standards. See you next time, she said, which felt like a benediction for ordinary days. Back in my kitchen, I pinned a fresh copy of the card beside the coffee filters, so every morning begins with procedure over panic. If a chime sounds, in the cabin, on a phone, in a life, I know what to do. I can't guarantee the outcome. I can guarantee the effort. I can transfer calm. I can buy time. I can turn seconds into runway. That's the story I promised to tell. Not about invincibility, but about a kept promise. Not about heroes, but about hands. Not about luck, but about leadership you can teach, repeat, and hand to a stranger at the side of the road. If this episode steadied your breathing, subscribe to The Story Beyond the Impact, tap like, and share it with the one person who might need a voice to borrow. We'll be here, telling the boring truth until it saves somebody else.